So it looks like the Israelis have leaked Trump's plan for a two-state solution. Now, I'm pretty surprised to find that such a plan exists because, frankly, if I had to guess, I would have thought all along that the Trump administration's preferred position on the problems with Israel and the Palestinians would be essentially to do what the Israelis have been doing and try and wait out the Palestinians and hopefully end up with a one-state solution eventually to where Israel can annex all of the West Bank and Gaza, or at the very least the West Bank, because it seems like they kind of gave up on Gaza since they pulled out of the settlements there. But as they continue to expand settlements in the West Bank, it seems pretty clear to me that they're trying to build up their population there so that they eventually will have no choice but to annex the West Bank. Because, of course, if there were to be any Palestinian state that was truly independent, they would have to excise the Israeli population somehow because the Israeli government would not allow the Palestinians to rule over that many Israeli citizens. But according to this leak that is supposedly the plan developed by Jared Kushner on behalf of Donald Trump, they essentially want to freeze the settlement process in place where it is now. Under this plan, there will be two states. You'll have Israel as it exists now, plus all the settlements in the West Bank will be included under the Israeli sovereignty, and then the rest of the West Bank and Gaza will be governed by the state of New Palestine. So under this proposal, Israel will only have direct control over the existing settlements, which are themselves geographically pretty small, even though they're spread out throughout the country. Now, the strategy I think, of the Israelis in setting up the settlements this way is that even though the settlements themselves are small, because they were so geographically dispersed, that gave the Israelis sort of an excuse to try and control all the land between the settlements and make it very difficult for Arabs to move about the West Bank. And that's how we ended up with the whole Area A, Area B, Area C division of the West Bank back in the 90s. There are these different zones of control within the West Bank, and Palestinians can't really traverse between them. You can't really move between these different areas very easily. It would be like crossing an international border, but because these are not cleanly divided areas, they're essentially, it's all dispersed throughout the entire West Bank. There's patches of Area A, Area B, Area C all mixed in together. Every time you go sometimes even a few miles, you'll have to go through another checkpoint because you're changing into a different, so-called area of the West Bank. This plan would completely do away with all that. The only distinction would be between what is under the sovereignty of the new Palestinian state and what is under Israeli sovereignty, which would be the settlements themselves. So the surrounding areas are still completely controlled by the Palestinians. And so if this is the case, if the way this plan is going to work, that the Israelis will only have direct control over the settlements themselves, meaning that Israeli law will apply within the settlements but not outside the settlements, then the only way this plan will work is if there is freedom of movement between these two new states. Essentially what you'll kind of have is a mini European Union where there are no internal borders, but you do have separate governments. I think Bosnia is set up in a similar way to where you have the Serb zone and the zone with the Muslims and the Croats, but there is no border checkpoints between the two, even though they have totally separate laws that don't overlap. So as long as you don't have hard borders like this, it actually works out just fine to have Israeli sovereignty sprinkled in through very geographically small parts of the West Bank. And so as far as Gaza is concerned under this plan, the blockade on Gaza will be removed, and there was supposed to be a freedom of movement of people and goods from Gaza and through the rest of Israel and the West Bank. So like I said, the internal barriers seem to pretty much disappear under this plan, which frankly, if you remove the blockade on Gaza, I think that a lot of the problems that Israel is facing with the Palestinians goes away pretty quick, because a big problem that the Gazans have is that they are cut off from the rest of the world, and so their only recourse then is to attack the Israelis. Now, of course, the next problem then is how are you going to have Gaza and the West Bank be a single state without having a bunch of Palestinians having to traverse through a pretty big chunk of Israel to get between Gaza and the West Bank. And so unlike with the Israeli settlements, where it looks like they're just going to let the Israeli settlers cross through the Palestinian zone and back into Israel if they want, and back and forth, with between Gaza and the West Bank, it looks like they're going to build a dedicated highway which does not cut through Israel but above Israel. It'll be like a giant bridge, except over land instead of water. So they say this highway is supposed to stretch up 30 meters above Israel and cut across between Gaza and the West Bank so that the Palestinians have a direct line between their zones, which makes sense considering that that's a lot easier than, say, building dedicated highways between each of the Israeli settlements, which would really just, chop up the West Bank and cut off the Palestinians. Now, additionally, the Egyptians are supposed to give up some land on the border with Gaza and Sinai, which is supposed to be used for an airport. Because, of course, if you're not familiar with Gaza, Gaza is like one big city. There's not really any open space there. So in order for there to be sort of an independent Palestinian airport, which is not, so they don't necessarily have to use the Israeli airport, there will be an airport built in what is now Egypt on the border with Gaza. However, the plan specifies the Palestinians cannot live and reside in this zone that's being given to them by the Egyptians. Now, the big elephant in the room here, of course, is Jerusalem, which Trump recognized as the capital of Israel earlier this year, or actually it was last year, I think. Which, frankly, even though it was considered to be a diplomatic blunder by a lot of people, I actually agreed with the move simply because that is the reality. It's silly to try and play this game of the diplomatic game of recognizing or unrecognizing certain countries or certain things when reality simply doesn't reflect that. It's just like after the end of the Chinese Civil War, Chiang Kai-shek was not the leader of China anymore. Mao Zedong was. So recognizing Chiang Kai-shek did not suddenly make him the leader of China. It never did. And until the day he died, he only controlled Taiwan. The same is true here. Claiming that Tel Aviv is the capital of Israel and putting an embassy there and a consulate in Jerusalem is just silly because the Israeli government is in Jerusalem, and we typically understand the capital of a country to be where the government is based. So whether you like that the capital is in Jerusalem or not is another matter, but the fact is that the capital has been there for as long as the Israelis have controlled Jerusalem. I mean, frankly, that'd be like saying that the capital of West Germany is Berlin when for 40 years or however long West Germany existed, the capital was based in Bonn. Now, under this plan, the Israelis do not get total total control over Jerusalem in the sense that it is Israel's capital and Israel's alone. The Kushner plan here is kind of playing the same line that the UN plan back in 1947, I think it was, or 48, to where Jerusalem is the capital of both states, both the Jewish and the Arab state, which I think makes most sense because both of them, if you think of the words Israel and Palestine, they are synonyms. They describe the same piece of land. So it would fit then that they would both consider the same city to be their capital. So therefore, if you're truly going to have an Israeli state and a Palestinian state, well then you would need them both to be based in Jerusalem, which shouldn't be a problem. Jerusalem is a big city. They can fit two legislatures. But something that the Israelis, I'm sure, will appreciate in this Kushner plan is that even though both states will be using Jerusalem, the Israelis will have direct control over governing Jerusalem. So in that sense, it'll be kind of like Jerusalem is an Israeli city and the Palestinians are merely their guests. Unfortunately, though, I can't think of a better way of doing this. I think that if you had an independent government of Jerusalem that was elected only and was controlled only by the people who resided in Jerusalem, you would also have problems. So, this isn't a great way of doing it, but I can't think of a better way than just, kind of giving the Israelis de facto control over the city, because there are other provisions in here that kind of would protect the Palestinians against the excesses of Israeli governance over Jerusalem, and that is that Israelis cannot move into any more Palestinian houses. They can't. They essentially would lock the property rights down of the Jews and the Arabs or I should say rather the Israeli citizens and the citizens of the new Palestinian state, since there are some Arab Israelis, but Israelis and Palestinians would not be able to trade property amongst each other. Whoever owns what would be locked down at the point that this deal is signed, and they could only trade amongst themselves. So that means that the Israelis could not, essentially claim eminent domain over the Palestinians living in Jerusalem, bulldoze their houses, and then build new houses on top of it for Israelis, which, has kind of been a big thing that the Israelis have tended to do throughout history. So we already know now that the new Palestinian state will not have direct governance over its capital city, since it will have to share it with the Israelis. And apparently, under this plan, it also will not have a military. Under this plan, the Palestinian state would only be able to have, sort of armed guys for internal policing. They could not have a true military that, say, would go off and fight wars in different countries. And this is the part of the deal where you realize that this isn't exactly a two-state solution. This is sort of like a power-sharing agreement, because in reality, this new Palestinian state, even though it does look very promising in terms of autonomy for the Palestinians, it is autonomy within the broader umbrella of Israel. Under this plan, Israel and New Palestine will not be two states in the sense that Israel and Lebanon are two states, or in the sense that Egypt and Libya are two states. This will be much more like the settlement that came out of the Bosnian War in the 90s, to where you had areas of Serb sovereignty and areas of Muslim and Croat sovereignty, but it was all Bosnia, which frankly I think is a very reasonable outcome, considering that the amount of violence and fighting that goes on a regular basis in Israel and the occupied territories over this matter. I think that this is worlds above, could be any way you could describe the status quo. So is this necessarily what anybody would want? Maybe not. I don't think that there will be a ton of people who would be thrilled at this, but I think that for the people on the ground, this would be a much better outcome than anything else that they've had to hope for in recent decades. Because even though here, what you'll essentially end up with is a Palestinian protectorate within Israel, because according to this plan, Israel will be treaty bound to protect the new Palestinian state against foreign aggression, so it will not be truly independent. But if you have internal autonomy and you control your own, you can make your own laws, you control your own land, you have your property rights, which I think is the key thing here, is that the Israelis can't just waltz in and evict people from their homes, like, that's the big thing that the Palestinians like to protest against, is al-Nakba in 1948. That was Israelis coming in and kicking Palestinians out of their homes. If this deal is put into effect as written, that will not happen ever again. There will be a clear border as to who makes the law where. Under this plan, no Israeli court can rule that a Palestinian does not own his or her own home. The only way that the Israelis could take land from the Palestinians under this plan would be if they break the agreement, which frankly doesn't sound like it would be too smart of a decision, because the deal is supposedly underwritten by not only the U.S., but by the Gulf states, by Egypt, and by the European Union. So therefore, as long as the U.S. Maintains its commitment to this deal in the long term, which again, who knows if that's going to be the case, but I could hope, under the best case scenario, if the U.S. maintains their commitment to this, there's really no way that the Israelis could try and expand their holdings beyond what they currently have. And that's really what this deal kind of does, is it freezes the battle lines in place, and it says, sure, there may have been a lot of injustices in the past, but we can't necessarily fix that without creating a lot more problems, so let's just freeze things where they are so that things don't continue to get worse for everyone. So then, how does Trump expect this deal to actually pass? Because this seems like the kind of thing that would be very difficult to get either the Palestinians, because of course, there are multiple Palestinian parties that need to be consulted here, and the Israelis. It would be very difficult, I think, to get all of them on board for this. So Trump's plan is essentially to coerce all of the involved parties into submitting to the deal. And so the way that works is that if the Israelis decide not to accept this deal, the Trump administration claims, according to this leak, now this sounds very far-fetched to me, but perhaps, Trump's kind of a crazy guy, maybe he'd actually go through with it, they would cut off foreign aid to Israel if they refuse this deal. Now, Israel currently gets, I think, nearly $4 billion a year from the U.S., so they'd be giving up a big chunk of change. Now, the same is true of the PLO government in the West Bank. Mahmoud Abbas and his people get also a lot of money from the U.S. government, which Trump would cut off if Abbas does not sign on to this deal and include the West Bank in it. Now, of course, the third side is Hamas in Gaza, and if Hamas doesn't agree to the deal, Trump will back the Israelis invading Gaza and essentially making them submit by force. So it seems to me like this is a my way or the highway kind of deal, which, I mean, to be honest, if you're going to force a deal onto this, I don't think that this could be worse than the current situation. The current situation is just terrible with Israel and the occupied territories. Now, of course, something I failed to mention is that the reason why Hamas probably won't want to submit to this deal is that because the new Palestinian state is not supposed to have a military, Hamas will have to disarm and give over their weapons to Egypt, which means no more. They lose that bargaining chip of firing rockets into Israel if they kind of do something they don't like. But Israel does a lot of things that Hamas doesn't like to begin with. So, and of course, Hamas didn't start out with all these rockets. They had to be smuggled in. So if Israel goes back on, goes back on their end of the deal and, say, blockades Gaza again after Hamas disarms, and the U.S. for some reason doesn't want to hold up its end of the deal and they're kind of screwed, well, then Hamas will just have to start smuggling in more weapons again. But, supposedly the reason why Hamas fires rockets and things at the Israelis is because they want to end the blockade. Well, this deal is supposed to end the blockade. So overall, this seems like a pretty good deal to me. I think that it could be a lot worse. Obviously, I don't think that there's such a thing as a good deal to end this sort of a conflict. There's not going to be a situation in which everyone is happy because obviously, either side would like to have the whole country to themselves, but I don't think it's really feasible in the 21st century to expel either all of the Israelis or all of the Palestinians from this area. So it's a lot better to kind of freeze the battle lines where they are and let people run their own affairs in their own areas. And in that case, hopefully, everyone can get on with their lives and try and put all of this violence behind them. Which, again, I know in the Middle East, having long grudges, and frankly in Europe, I think it's worse in Europe, actually, having long grudges that last multiple centuries, let alone decades, is a pretty common tradition, but hopefully they can buck this trend eventually. So if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, please do click the bell because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.